Welcome inside another episode of Mountaineer Report here on WV Sports Now, and I am Mike Asti, and we are going to now talk West Virginia-Kansas State, the Mountaineers' upcoming opponent. So we're going to put a pin in all the commentary and discussion about Neal Brown's comments from his weekly press conference and his future and how mad the fans are, and move into previewing this game because he does have another night game against another ranked opponent. And yeah, fans are going to be having some fun and tailgating, but that fun's going to leave you if the team doesn't perform and loses again. And the schedule does get easier for West Virginia to stay in the Big 12 race after this game, but this might be the last chance to really prove to the fans that he can win a big game. Kansas State, a 5-1, 2-1 team in conference play, is legit and would be a big win. And a game in hand over them would actually bump you ahead of them in conference play and in the Big 12 standings, as insane as that sounds. So to have this conversation, I am going to welcome back Katie Maher of WIBW in Topeka, Kansas, who joined us a few weeks ago to preview the Kansas game. That was a win for West Virginia and the beginning, or kind of the continuing, of a rough road for the Jayhawks. So, Katie, how have you been since we last talked?
Just, hoping for a Jayhawk win whenever we can get one in the near future, and enjoying K-State football right now after an ugly loss at BYU, but a good bounce back since.
Yeah, and a bye in the middle there and some quality victories here. The BYU loss doesn't feel that bad right now when you look at what BYU has been this year after kind of a rough road a season ago. And yeah, that's a different dichotomy there covering those two programs, certainly this year, to say the least. And in addition, for any of you video listeners, because you can find this on YouTube, you want to hit the notification bell, also hit to be able to subscribe to this channel, but also can find us everywhere you get your podcast, audio-wise, Apple, Spotify, TuneIn, Google Play, etc. For any of the video listeners, you may see Katie, you may also see her dog. There you go. What's the dog's name?
Her name is Lilo. She's 2 years old. She's 10 pounds of fury.
Okay.
We want to make sure that she doesn't bark during this, so we are keeping her right here.
Okay. But I liked seeing a brief glimpse of her nonetheless, though. A cute dog for sure. And I had an ex that actually had a dog kind of like that. A little bit smaller even, actually. It was so small that you have to avoid kicking it accidentally. But that's a perfect size. And then
when I first got her, I had a real problem with watching where I was walking.
yeah, I would imagine. Yeah, I would imagine. They don't know that they're that small. They're like, I'm just going to go wherever. And that's kind of
80 pounds. That's why she barks. She's got small lung syndrome.
I'm sure she has the lungs of an 80-pounder, even if she is only 10 pounds. So again, Katie Maher here of WIBW in Topeka, Kansas, as we're going to talk West Virginia, Kansas State on Mountaineer Report. So I do kind of want to get the vibe and the tenor around the Kansas State program going into this game from you. Maybe if you were at any of those press conferences or heard from the coaches and players on what was said, especially what they're expecting from West Virginia, because this is a West Virginia program that is obviously coming off of a loss, coming off of now drama. I don't know if they were aware of any of that from whenever their press conference was, but a team that has won. They did beat Kansas. They did really put it on Oklahoma State on the road, even though this Cowboys team is down this year. You almost never know what you're going to get with West Virginia, and it is a night game in Morgantown, which historically is good for the Mountaineers, even though not so much this year.
Yeah, I mean, the overall vibe right now is just, I don't want to say it's desperation time, but since it's midway through the season and K-State is not atop the Big 12 rankings where they think they should be, barring that BYU loss. I think the fact that K-State is in the middle of the Big 12 rankings right now just speaks to how insane the Big 12's conference is right now. Yeah. You have teams at the top that you're like, Texas Tech, what are you doing there, I think I don't want to say desperation, but a little bit of that feeling, simply because this is a team that thinks they can go to the Big 12 championship. This is a team that thinks they could be in the college football playoff. And if they lose another game, that looks extremely slight given how good the rest of the is and how there are still undefeated teams in conference play. So I think it's kind of we need to win everything. And this is a team that has struggled historically with road games. They play incredibly well at home. And then they go on the road, and then that BYU game happens, which I don't even think that game was a true indicator of what BYU K-State would be like. I think that was just like
I was going to get to that.
Just needed to kick K-State in the butt. I think if they played again, it'd be a very different story. Not saying different result in the end, but a very different score at least. But because of that, I think K-State is just like, they get a really good road win at Colorado on Saturday night. Say what you want about Travis Hunter being out for the second half of the game.
Right.
But he was still down. They were down by 2 scores when he left. So it's not like K-State was come back from anything. They were ahead the whole time.
And that BYU score you're bringing up, 38-9.
Yeah.
So that was a convincing victory for BYU, and that was their coming out party this year. That hey, we're going to be a player in the Big 12. After last year, West Virginia dominated BYU in Morgantown, and that was a good West Virginia team. But BYU looked like they were going to be a program that needed several years to get going. But that's not the case in this very weird 2024 season that you alluded to.
Yeah, Utah was picked to finish the Big 12 first, and that's definitely not going to happen now. And K-State was picked to finish second. Don't even get me started on KU being picked to finish fourth.
Some of the picks, the Big 12 media, my colleagues and I, we definitely swung and missed.
For sure. Which I always, like, from the start, I was like, I don't think Utah finishing first is going to be accurate. I'm always kind of, I don't want to say I'm like a homer for the teams who have already been in the conference, but I think
that's fair. I did pick Utah, but I get that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think Big 12 teams took it personally when a newcomer was picked to finish first,
Sure. I could see that. And part of Cam Rising hurt again. He missed some games. So
could
that's
be
an issue.
Now.
Now they're basically going with a true freshman. Like, that would be insane if Utah would able to come in there now, although the conference is so wide open that you only need to be a 2 seed, not a 1, to get in the Big 12 title game. So you never know. But that kind of was a compliment to Utah the last 20 years in the Pac-12 and even a little bit before. But an insult probably to the current Big 12 programs, because the whole message was to programs like BYU, you need to take a while to join us and compete. And that wasn't what the media said. But it does look like right now the Utah is not a player. But this game is oddly a game that, despite, I think everyone would agree, Kansas State is a better team than West Virginia. They're favored in this game despite being on the road, and they've been a better team than West Virginia. But West Virginia is 2-1 in conference play. Kansas State is 2-1 in conference play. Kansas State has already lost to BYU. West Virginia does not play BYU. They don't play Utah. They don't play Colorado. If you look at that WVU schedule, they don't play any of these teams we're talking about. They got a break from most of these teams this year. If West Virginia somehow wins this game and beats Kansas State, they weirdly, despite fans wanting to fire the coach and controversy and all of that, they weirdly are in a comfortable, relatively solid spot in the conference. And then if they beat Arizona, they're in like a weird driver's seat because the schedule is pretty much all the bottom of the conference to end the year. Was any of that brought up in terms of the sense of urgency for Kansas State? Any of their players bring up that this is almost, as weird as this is to say, for a team favored who is a recent conference champ that has been a better program, Kansas State is almost in a must-win right now. And you could argue they're more desperate than West Virginia, because if they lose a game in hand at WVU, they already have the game in hand loss to BYU. That would be hard to climb out of that hole, even though you maybe are the better team. Yeah.
I think this is a program that really views every week as a must win, which most college football programs do.
Yeah.
But there's Lilo.
There. What does she think?
Views every week as a must win because that's just the way that they are. Upon the stone, all that fun stuff. It's the culture that they've built.
Yeah, it's worked. I mean, they're a program on the rise, to say the least.
But their biggest thing is that they don't want to look too far ahead. So when they're saying that everything is a must win, it's just because they view every week as we just need to win because that's the expectation in Kansas State football. Mm-hmm. It's a program of rich history and tradition and all that stuff. But Coach Kleiman has said that in the past, they've had a bad problem of looking too far ahead. So he doesn't want them thinking about the Big 12 championship in week 2. He doesn't want them thinking about the Big 12 championship in week 6 or 7. He wants them to just focus on that week at hand because they're not going to achieve those later goals if they're too busy thinking about them, because they're going to miss out on all the things that they need to do in order to achieve those goals, which is just focusing on the present and the team at hand,
That makes sense. Yeah.
But yeah, so I don't want to say it's desperation time. I just think that they're aware that with 16 teams in the Big 12 now, and the fact that halfway through the season, they're not at the top of the conference like they were hoping they'd be, they just know that they can't take any opponent not seriously,
Yeah. And the one loss is to a team that they maybe didn't expect, but is right there at the top of the conference, is going to be a contender in this conference, it looks like, this year, and is a conference loss. So conference losses mean more than out of conference losses, obviously, here. Katie Maher of WIBW-TV in Topeka, Kansas, as we are talking West Virginia and Kansas State, upcoming matchup for the Mountaineers. A ranked opponent under the lights at night, national TV in Morgantown. It didn't work out against Iowa State. I don't know how much you watched of that game. Kind of blew it at the end. But we'll see what happens here in this matchup with Kansas State. Now, Kansas State clearly likes to run with Giddens. His last 2 games, over 180 yards in both of them. So that right there is just, it screams at you. That's going to be what they want to do. They want to establish that, and good luck to West Virginia trying to stop it, although they did contain Ollie Gordon a couple weeks ago. What do you think maybe could cause Kansas State problems, though, whether it's something that they're struggling with or something maybe about West Virginia? I did actually hear Kansas State's play-by-play jump on some shows and talk about that he thinks Garrett Green, and if he runs more than he's even been and goes back to 2023 Garrett Green, when he kind of was really a dual threat, this year he's got away from it a little bit, that he could be a problem because Kansas State, he thinks, maybe could struggle to try to catch him. Is that something you agree with? What do you think could be an issue in this game for Kansas State?
I think containing a mobile quarterback is a hard thing to do these days. We're seeing a lot of defenses struggling with that. I see that for sure being an option. But I think the biggest struggle for K-State will just be, if they face adversity, are they going to be able to respond to it? Because that's what happened to them at BYU, and they didn't respond to it, and they could only kick 3 field goals to score. This team, when it's clicking, is like one of the best teams on TV at that given moment, Yeah. And the fact that they're in prime time too, I think they always play a little bit better in prime time. If they're not going to be at home, they at least have that going for them. But like you said, this is a team that loves to run the ball because they have DJ Giddens. I could write a novel about DJ Giddens and how underrated he is as a running back in the Big 12 and just in the country in general.
Look at the numbers, Yeah,
no one talks about him. And, it could be because of the way he goes about his business. For reference, for people who don't know, he's an extremely quiet guy. When we talk to him in availability, he doesn't usually come to midweek availability, but after a game, when he's out, there's 20 people around him with a camera and with microphones and stuff, and he's given a few word answers because that's just the way that he is. He's just soft spoken, doesn't say a lot. He's not a showboat. If you watch him when he gets a big run for a first down or gets touchdown, he just finds the ref, throws the ball back, and walks away. And all of his teammates are coming up to him and celebrating.
Very rare these days. Very rare.
He's such a rarity. And that's why I'm maybe it's just because he's not a showboat. Maybe that's why people don't talk about him, because he's not the guy who's doing all the fun celebration dances and all that stuff. But he was left out of when the Doak Walker Award preseason watch list was released. And 5 Big 12 running backs were named to that list.
Yeah. Jaheim White, West Virginia, is one of them. Yeah.
Yeah. Ollie Gordon was on it. Devin Neal was on it from KU. Of that list, DJ was one of the only ones left out of the actual graphic. They put 4 Big 12 running backs in that graphic and didn't put DJ Giddens. And I was like,
okay.
Really?
The one having the best year. He's the one having the best year right now.
Exactly. And even after the Colorado game this past week, the Big 12 posted and deleted a tweet and posted a new version after where I forget the exact wording, but I do remember reading it and being like, what? Because they basically said something along the lines of making his name known in the Big 12, or it was add another running back to the list of top running backs in the Big 12. That's pretty much what it was, that second option there. And everyone in the comments was like, what do you mean add him to the list? He's in there. He had a monster season last year.
The game before was pretty good. Yeah.
Literally.
Yeah.
He's averaging like almost 200 yards a game.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's interesting for sure. Do you catch any chip on his shoulder, though? In the few words he does
I think because of the way he goes about his business, he's got a good head on his shoulders. He's a Northeast Kansas kid. He's from Junction City. It's a high school interviewing area. So, his town is very proud of him. But everyone knows what he's like, and no one's really expecting anything else because of the way he goes about his business. And I don't think he has a chip on his shoulder because I don't really think he cares. I think he's like, I'm just going to work hard and do what I do. And who cares if they say that I'm not good enough? I'm going to prove him wrong. He's a guy that's going to play on Sundays one day,
Yeah. And the stats again back that up here. Katie Maher, WIBW-TV in Topeka, Kansas, talking to me as we're previewing West Virginia, Kansas State. And for Giddens' season so far, 182 against Colorado, 187 against Oklahoma State, 93 against BYU in the loss, but 93 against BYU still, 86 against Arizona, 114 Tulane, and then the FCS game 124, averaging 7.3 per carry this year for 786 yards. So that's enough right there to tell you that, and his usage rate, of course, in that FCS game, it's not like they're trying to kill him throughout that game either. The stats were still there. So he's putting up numbers, and West Virginia has endured running backs single-handedly crushing them in the last couple years. Again, Ollie Gordon last year did do that. Granted, not as much this year. I do think the D-line and the linebacker crew maybe can face a guy like this better than they would have been a year ago. I do want to kind of ask you, if West Virginia is having success against Giddens, hypothetically, do you believe Kansas State can win a game if they have to do it exclusively through the air? Because in all the wins, he's got over 100 yards. He's been that force that has led their offense. And West Virginia's secondary, as we talked weeks ago, I still think is a weakness, even though it's been better than it was at that time. Can they do it just at that secondary if Giddens is neutralized?
Yes, and that was the number one misconception that a lot of people had going into the season and the first few early weeks of the season was, can Avery Johnson throw the ball? Yeah. He came out of high school as one of the top dual threat quarterbacks in the class of 2023 numbers. And, everyone just said he's a tall, skinny running back. Like, that's all he's got. Because I watched the kid play in high school. He's a Kansas native. I watched him drop 5 touchdowns on the ground against one of our local schools here. He's a nuts talent. But the first few weeks of the season, it was very we weren't seeing the explosive plays out of him, both on the ground and in the air. They weren't letting him move a lot is what a lot of people felt like. And whether that be they just didn't want to show, if you don't have to show all your fun plays and all the things your quarterback can do in your non-conference games, why show it? Because, they went 3-0 in their non-conference slate, so I guess they didn't really have to. So that was a concern that people had at first was well, are these offensive coordinators, Matt Wells and Connor Riley, going to let him do what he's good at? And in the BYU game is when I think something kind of clicked where it was they need to let him be more mobile because that's where he's most comfortable. And since that, I think we've really seen him prove that when he gets the option of moving around, he can either break free for a run or he can then find his guy downfield and throw a bomb. Then it's been proven, right. And I think in the last few weeks that Avery Johnson's very capable of passing the ball. And he's had a lot of explosive plays. Just against Colorado last week, he had 2 or 3 huge passes that went to Jace Brown and were plays that kept them in the game when Colorado was storming back in the second half. And that was a prime example of them responding to adversity. They were up by over 2 scores and they allowed a comeback by Colorado in the third quarter. And that fourth quarter came down to could Avery Johnson and his offense throw the ball more, because at halftime, basically DJ already had over 130 yards in the first half on the ground.
Yeah.
So at halftime, Colorado changed up their defense, and they weren't, and K-State wasn't able to run the ball as much. So they had to adapt to that adversity, and Avery responded well, I think, and proved that he's a quarterback. He can throw the ball. He can't just run the ball. He can do both. So I think if they're forced to throw the ball, he's very capable of doing so. Because I mean, he's had games just against Oklahoma State, which was a top 25 matchup at the time. He combined for over 300 something yards.
Yeah, he threw for 259 in that game,
Yeah.
and that's the game he had to throw the most. That's
Yep.
the only game this year he had to have over 30 pass attempts, 31 in that game. Every other game's in the 20s generally. His completions are in the teens, but still a solid percentage. It looks like efficiency and not getting over 30 pass attempts is still the recipe for Kansas State here. But the yards, 259 in that game, 224 against Colorado. The other ones are in the hundreds, but he's getting more yards the weeks go by. 1,103 on the year, 11 TDs. The 5 picks, though, it's similar to a Garrett Green recipe a little bit, where there's some passing, there's obviously some running as well, there's some TDs, but there's too many picks and too many mistakes mixed in there. So I would imagine, too, that West Virginia probably wins this game. You're probably seeing an interception from him, an interception or two that West Virginia takes advantage of. They were not able to do that against Iowa State. They didn't flip anything, and Iowa State, of course, scored 14 points off of turnovers. So part of it is Garrett Green needs to be really, really smart as well. What do you think Kansas State brings to the table defensively? You know West Virginia is a run-first team. You know Garrett Green's a dual threat. You know he's kind of made some mistakes recently, and they actually are banged up receiver-wise. Jaden Bray's going to be out for this game again, so he's the major transfer, likely number one, with Hudson Clement, that is not going to be playing. What kind of defense does Kansas State bring to the table, and how much do they match up against the Mountaineers?
Yeah, K-State prides itself on having a physical brand of defense. Chris Kleinman is a defensive-minded coach first and foremost, but his defensive coordinator, Joe Klannerman, is one of the more solid defensive coordinators in the game of college football, in my opinion. They're a defense that prides itself on creating chaos. So they, if they walk away from a game and they didn't force at least one turnover, whether that's a forced fumble, whether it's a strip sack, whether it's an interception, like that's a defense that's not happy, because turnovers are a big part of how you win games in college football. More often than not, the team that has more turnovers is going to win the game.
100%. Yep.
So it's a defense and that was actually a problem early in the season, was they didn't really force any turnovers at all in the first few games, and the defense was very frustrated. So they, as the coaches say, went back to the drawing board and figured out what was going on, and we've seen them create that chaos in games since. So it's a team that, like I said, prides itself on turnovers, and they want to create chaos. They want to put pressure on the quarterback. It's a lot of blitzing when they have to. So I think it's going to come down to, will that pressure break Garrett Green?
And the West Virginia offense has at times been able to be very successful, be very potent, be very dangerous. Ask Oklahoma State. But Kansas State has not allowed anybody besides BYU to get over 30 points on them. So everyone has been under 30 except for BYU, that, of course, won 38-9. So if you take out that outlier, it's been actually one of the better defensive units in the conference, let alone the country. That outlier hurts the averages a little bit there for K-State. But the West Virginia offense, when it's clicking outside of the Iowa State-Penn State game, they're getting over 30 points. They even scored over 30 against Pitt. Kansas, if they get over 30 in this game, that would be a big deal for Kansas State and a big defensive lapse. And again, another thing that maybe you can look at, that if West Virginia gets over 30, maybe that is how they win this game, because that would mean likely mistakes are happening for Kansas State's defense, and they're probably not getting the turnovers that they would like to normally generate here. Katie Maher again of WIBW. West Virginia, Kansas State coming up. The Mountaineers at 3-3, 2-1 in conference play, coming off the loss to Iowa State. Kansas State is 5-1, 2-1 in conference play, and looking to hang on to a ranking, looking to hang on to still a chance to win the Big 12 this year. Now a more wide open conference than ever before. And as insane as this sounds, West Virginia is still looking to have a chance to win the Big 12, which should be, this almost will be one of those years that a team like West Virginia, after such a bad out of conference schedule with so much drama going on there, would somehow do it with 8 wins. Like, this is how the Big 12's been this year.
Yeah.
The fans would want the coach fired despite being in Dallas. Like that would, because the fans would still be off the climb. And again, they win this. It does get a little easier outside of a trip to Arizona. Now, the Vegas spread right now I'm seeing from different sports books is Kansas State being favored by 3.
Mm-hmm.
They're at home. They are clearly the better team here. How do you see this game shaking out if you had to give a prediction for this?
Yeah, I did say earlier in the week when I saw the spread at that point was 2.5.
Yeah, it's
I
moved.
did have K-State winning and covering because I think I want to, I cover them so much that I see how badly this team wants to prove that they deserve that number 1 spot in the Big 12 because I mean with Texas and Oklahoma leaving, we kind of talked about this a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
The conference, we knew the conference was going to be wide open. I mean, right now it's true. The conference is wide open. So it's just how, people were predicting. But with it being wide open in a sense that K-State wants to emerge this year in the first year without Texas and OU, this is a program that wants to emerge as the top dog in the Big 12 that other teams strive to beat like they have against Texas and Oklahoma for years. And because they have such a rich history of tradition within the football program, I feel like it's more surprising than anything that they already haven't been considered that. I think it's just because of how changing the Big 12 has been lately. I do think K-State continues its hot streak and comes out with a win in this. With it being such a small spread too, even if they were to lose, I can only imagine it being an insanely close game.
Yeah, and it's a bit of a weird. I think the spread's a little bit odd. I mean, obviously West Virginia is at home, so they're not going to put a 10-point spread in favor of the road team. That just very rarely happens. You'd have to almost be an FCS situation to somehow have that occur.
Yeah.
But Iowa State was favored by 5 in many sports books coming into a game at night in Morgantown with a ranking in almost the identical scenario. So it appears that sports books do believe Iowa State is better than Kansas State, and they're more confident in Iowa State than Kansas State, and that's what the AP rank says as well. Mm-hmm. And Kansas State probably can blame the BYU loss for that because Iowa State's undefeated. So there is a difference in what the view was going into the Iowa State game versus this. And West Virginia is now coming off another really bad performance, whereas prior to that game, West Virginia was coming off a great performance against Oklahoma State. So that is why it's interesting. It's almost like there are some people betting that almost think the law of averages feel like that maybe the Mountaineers are going to get one here because they've just been kind of down.
Yeah, and this is kind of the point in the season where a team can get into a rut. And that's what's happened to KU for the last 2 years is they would get their first conference loss and then they would keep losing for a few games. Yeah. And so I think that could be an issue for West Virginia for sure.
Yeah, 100%. And I do think Kansas State is probably going to win this game as well. Although I've said this on shows, the way the Neal Brown tenure works, this would be very Neal Brown-esque to get this win. The ranked wins he does have, and there's only been a few of them, the 3-17 against ranked opponents is insane in year 6 here. But a couple of them are against Kansas State. He's actually, I'd imagine the program is probably maybe even extra motivated to not let Neal Brown have a whole resume of just ranked wins over Kansas State. Yeah. As odd as that would be, if they're going to be the top dog and Neal Brown just somehow owns them, because that would be the situation if Neal Brown gets another one over 17th ranked in the AP in Kansas State. Before I let you get out of here, though, for you, and obviously you're connected with Kansas State and cover them. Kansas has been a letdown, but you follow the whole Big 12 here. Who do you think is the best team in this conference? Is maybe you want to give a prediction going to be the Big 12 champion? And do you think any of these teams have a legit shot to compete nationally in the college football playoffs? You're going to automatically be in there if you win the conference. But I've even heard some say that if the Big 12 doesn't, get their act together here and Kansas State doesn't avoid the upset, that there actually be a group of 5 team that could be ranked ahead of them, because right now you're looking at Iowa State, Kansas State, and it dissipating from what it was in terms of BYU, in terms of the ranked teams before. But do you think any of these teams actually can compete nationally, and who is that team?
Yeah, I think And I don't want to come across like I'm hating on the Big 12,
Right.
but when it comes to football, like SEC.
Yeah, it's not basketball. We're not talking basketball. Yeah.
I mean, we watched K-State win a Big 12 championship and then go to the Sugar Bowl and just get kind of demolished by Alabama. And that was an Alabama team that only went to the Sugar Bowl, that wasn't in the college football playoff that year.
Yeah.
It's so hard for me to have a vote of confidence in any Big 12 teams right now being able to make it far in the college football playoff. I think that, it's either going to be Georgia, Bama, the usuals, although that Vanderbilt loss might keep Bama out of the playoffs now.
Yeah, maybe, or Oregon now after the win over Ohio State, but still the Buckeyes too.
I think Oregon and Ohio State are going to meet again for a Big Ten championship. I think both of them could absolutely end up in the college football playoff, and I don't think right now, I don't think any Big 12 team can compete with any of those. How the top 5 looks right now, I think next year that if DJ Giddens is still with K-State, they could be a contender within the college football playoff because Avery Johnson will have more experience under his belt. He's still a very young quarterback. Like, he's a true sophomore. Right. And the team itself is very young. They have a brand new offensive line this year. I said before the season started, I was worried that the offensive line would be an issue this year. And that's why I was a little like, I don't know about ranking them second in Big 12 just yet. But, they've stepped up really well. They did get a lot of playing time while the old offensive line was playing last year and the year before that. But right now, I don't see a universe where a Big 12 team is playing for a national championship. And I'm sorry, but that's how I feel. I'm like, I'm watching the Ohio State Oregon game the other night, and I'm like,
it's a different world. We're over there. Like, When
it comes to basketball, there's 5 Big 12 teams in the preseason top 10 for a reason. But with football, I want to see some more consistency because, I feel like Texas is just going to go win the national championship this year in football.
Yeah. It also does look like lined up for Texas, who, of course, is no longer a Big 12 team. If we were talking a year ago, then you could say Texas, and obviously they made a run. Yeah. But, it does appear that way. It really almost appears that way for the ACC, too. It appears, Big Ten and SEC are going to have most of those teams in the playoff. They're getting most of those at-large bids outside of the conference champs. The runner-ups for those conference title games is guaranteedly getting in the playoff, where in the Big 12, the runner-up's probably not getting in. It probably will just be the conference champ because this whole thing of cannibalizing yourself is not going to probably be a benefit to try to help the conference get multiple teams in there. And
the only way that I could see the Big 12 runner-up also making the college football playoff is if K-State wins out, they manage to beat Iowa State in the final game of the year. That's Iowa State's only loss. And then the two meet again for the Big 12 championship. And at that point, it's like they could both be ranked in like the top 13, 12 teams in the country, because right now K-State's 17. And Iowa
then you get into the mess that you have to take the conference champ, but if you don't take Iowa State and that's their only loss to a ranked team, that looks ridiculous then. So that might force the issue depending on what goes on, especially because Notre Dame's lost the game to a group of 5, so it's not like they're undefeated. That might be an issue in a season where they were. The ACC pitch schedule is pretty easy from now on, but that's going to hurt them. They're not necessarily getting love, even though now they're ranked because their schedule is so easy. If Clemson beats them, that probably maybe takes them out of it. And maybe there's just a conference champ from the ACC as well. So, maybe that's the only chance there. It's a weird thing to kind of have to hope for to get a second team, but that maybe is the shot.
In Big 12 championship.
And Kansas State fans know all too well about winning a conference and not getting in. They saw TCU get in the playoff despite Kansas State winning the conference title. And of course, that was a similar scenario. The TCU was just so dominant. That was where they got tripped up, and that was a good team they got tripped up to. So it was hard to take the other one. Now you'd have to as an automatic bid, but that probably would be the scenario where that could happen. But competing nationally, men's basketball and even women's basketball, 4 ranked teams in the preseason top 25 as well, including actually one of them being West Virginia. That could be the top conference on the women's side as well. But football wise, it looks like they have a ways to go. And unfortunately for the conference, as much as maybe they're happy that Utah is having to wait or so, the team that nationally is kind of a darling is not a player this year. So if Utah was there and they were the team that got tripped up in the title game, it'd almost be a guarantee they would get taken. But it might be harder for these teams maybe that don't get as much love to get in those scenarios. Iowa State they haven't been in this spot of 6-0 since 1938. So I don't know how much the committee desperately needs them if they happen to get tripped up at some point here. Katie, I appreciate the time for sure. Maybe we'll do this again with a Big 12 championship looming, even if West Virginia's not playing or whatever goes on nationally, or maybe I'll have you on Sirius, because I do have a national show on Sirius XM to kind of talk separately from this as well. But thanks for the time to you and your dog. I no longer see on screen. Is she still there?
She's hiding.
Okay, there she goes. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, so I appreciate the time. I know you're not going to be in Morgantown again, so you're missing another night game opportunity in Morgantown. I know.
Instead, I will be at Arrowhead Stadium watching KU maybe get its first conference win.
Yeah, in a game that, let us know what happens there, because I don't know who's going to be checking in nationally. I don't know if that's going to be happening at this point for Kansas.
It's going to be like a 3-point game. Just watch.
And I do see that Kansas State has Kansas on the schedule coming up. So I don't know if you're a Kansas fan, you probably do not want West Virginia to win this game, because then you're going to get a Kansas State team that's going to be infuriated and just probably will destroy Kansas at that point. That might be worse.
The most terrifying K-State team ever is one that's coming off a road loss and is playing the next game at home.
Right.
Yeah, like a team that you don't want to play.
Right, especially a really talented team. I would also imagine that Kansas State would maybe lose their AP spot if they lose this game. West Virginia is obviously not a ranked team. They're 500. Maybe barely they would stay in there. That'll be interesting if they would lose. But it's hard to say Kansas State and who they are going to fall in this game. But if you ask Neal Brown, it's just about having some fun. So maybe West Virginia can win.
Who else cares?
Yeah, you win the tailgate. West Virginia got the tailgate on lock. So West Virginia can win the tailgate. And maybe you'll have to try to convince the station to send you for a basketball game. And maybe if the Mountaineers can compete this year, I know they're still kind of rebuilding with the new era of Darren DeVries, but maybe that can bring you to Morgantown. But
we shall see.
Yeah, Katie, I appreciate the time nonetheless, though. Have a good night.
Absolutely, you too.
Yeah. So Katie Maher of WIBW in Topeka, Kansas. We talked to her before to preview the Kansas game. That was a win by the Mountaineers, in which they came back and won in the final minutes there. And now talking to her to preview West Virginia, Kansas State. To say it's a big game would just be ludicrous. Obviously, it's a very, very big game. Obviously, it's a must-win game for West Virginia. As we talked about, it kind of is one for Kansas State, too, because they have a conference loss. This would be their second. And if West Virginia beats them, despite that rough out-of-conference schedule, and the Mountaineers are not ranked, and deservingly so, to not nearly be ranked, barely in the top 50 of even ESPN's FPI, West Virginia wins this game, they're going to have a game in hand over Kansas State, who is, supposed to be a top dog in the conference, a recent conference champ. 3 conference wins. Not many programs will be able to say that at this point. 3-1 in conference play with a win over Kansas State, even though you have that loss to Iowa State, would be a pretty solid scenario. Iowa State looks like they're going to cakewalk to the Big 12 title game in Dallas, but they need an opponent. And West Virginia doesn't play BYU, so they don't have to avoid that. They can avoid that being another loss on the schedule. And if BYU gets tripped up and they have a harder schedule down the stretch, and West Virginia beats Kansas State, and I'm assuming Texas Tech and Cincinnati and those teams kind of come back to earth and are not as competitive as they've been. West Virginia plays Cincinnati. They play Texas Tech. If they get those victories and they beat Kansas State and BYU loses a game, the Mountaineers are all of a sudden catapulting themselves to that number 2 spot. And obviously they lose the game in hand, and Iowa State should still be winning. And then somehow they're in Dallas. Now, that doesn't mean I think they're going to beat Arizona. West Virginia could absolutely lose that Arizona game, win or lose against Kansas State, and that could be an issue right there. But Arizona's been proven vulnerable. So even if you do, somehow they could get tripped up again, and then you're still in there. The Big 12 is so wide friggin' open that if West Virginia wins this game, as down as the program is right now, as much as the vibes are bad, and even though everybody and even the previous climb trusters are now off the Neal Brown bandwagon and no longer trusting anything he says, they would be back in this race. That would just be a fact of the conference. And there could be a wild scenario where you win 8 games, you're in the Big 12 title game because the conference has really been down and has not really been as elite as maybe some even projected. The normal favorite teams, the Utahs of the world, Oklahoma State are kind of taking this year off and dealing with their own issues. And if you win the conference, you're in. I don't even think they would win the conference in that scenario. I'm sure they would lose to probably Iowa State again. That's clearly a better team than the Mountaineers. But a win over Kansas State would absolutely put them back in the race, would keep them in the race, really, would get them in a comfortable position, really. It almost would allow them to drop the Arizona game and still be in that race the rest of the year with an easy schedule, and would almost eliminate Kansas State, as insane as that sounds, as another preseason darling, because they would lose that game in hand to a team that would have 3 conference wins, and they would have a loss to both BYU and West Virginia in that scenario, and that's not good for Kansas State, even though BYU is a very good team. So a lot on the line under the lights in Morgantown between the Mountaineers and Kansas State, and a must-win game to keep the vibes moving, but also a game that could keep the West Virginia team kind of in the race, kind of a must-win game as well for Kansas State to stay ranked, to stay in the race, to avoid the scenario that I just painted there that we talked about on this show. But thanks to Katie Maher again from WIBW for joining me again. She's joined me twice this year. Have to have her on some other show. Have to talk about the national scene. Maybe have her on Mic Drop as well for any of you watchers, listeners of me personally and my Mic Drop podcast. It's also on Sirius XM. So maybe talk more national scene there with her on that. Love the conversation with her and her dog. And yeah, it's hard to believe that any of these Big 12 teams that we're talking about or mentioning here, regardless of who ends up winning the conference and as wide open as it is, can actually be a player nationally and deserves any kind of at-large bid over any of these Big Ten SEC teams. It sucks to have a whole playoff with just those 2 conferences, but they are the best 2 conferences for a reason. Those conferences are loaded with the best teams in the country right now. And I think Indiana and those teams will eventually kind of dissipate and come back to earth, but there's still enough in the Big Ten. How can you not take Ohio State and Oregon? How can you not take Penn State after they just beat USC, even if they're not in the Big 12 title game? That's already 3 right there with the conference champ included. SEC, how can you not take Georgia? But how can you avoid all these other teams as well? The Tennessees, the Ole Misses, who's been tripped up, but they still look very, very good. Alabama has a loss to Vanderbilt, but besides that, they're still holding steady with rankings. It's hard to totally not take them as well, as long as they don't get tripped up again, because they have won, but South Carolina almost beat them, so that looks like a competitive team. It's top to bottom, deep, and very, very good for both the Big Ten and the SEC. And the ACC and Big 12 are clearly number 3 and 4. And who's better, 3 and 4? It's almost irrelevant, guys. We can argue about that all day. It's almost irrelevant. Probably would give an edge right now the ACC, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The conference champs are getting in, and the runner-up is going to have a rough road, unless the scenario that Katie did paint would happen, where you would have Iowa State go undefeated in the Big 12 title game and then lose. And if their one loss is to a ranked team in the title game, they're probably still getting in, and they would deserve to still get in. Those are those scenarios. Or if Clemson beats Pitt in the regular season, they go to the ACC title game, and then they lose to Miami, and their only loss of the year is to Miami that's been ranked all year. Again, that would be another scenario where you probably would take them both. Make sure to hit the subscribe button here. Make sure to hit the notification bell for notifications whenever we upload anything here on our YouTube channel. Also find us everywhere you get your podcast audio-wise, Apple, Spotify, TuneIn, Google Play, etc. Follow Katie on social media. You can also find her, Katie Maher. Let me get her Twitter handle up here, or X. So she is at WIBW-Katie right now on X and on social media. So follow her there, find her coverage there. And I'm, of course, at Mike Asti 11 everywhere on social media. But stick with WV Sports Now for all your coverage of the Mountaineers, of this game coming up, of the rest of WVU Athletics as well. And we'll be back at that next press conference. After this game, Monday, I'll be there. We'll be back. We're gonna keep on coming. We'll give you more, because obviously those press conferences now apparently are must see TV on what'll get said in those.